My parents convinced me to let them protect the $180,000 I had saved for my first home. 2 weeks later, my younger brother celebrated a wedding so extravagant it looked like something from a celebrity magazine. When I asked for my money back, my father smiled and said, "Your brother needed it more than you did." 6 years later, those same parents stood at my front door begging me to save the home they were about to lose. My name is Nathan Collins, and I'm 32 years old. I had spent nearly 8 years working as an electrical engineer, accepting overtime whenever it was available, and living far below my means. While most of my friends upgraded their cars or traveled every summer, I saved almost every extra dollar because I dreamed of owning a home before starting a family of my own. By the time I turned 32, I had saved $180,000. It wasn't inherited money or a lucky investment. Every dollar represented missed vacations, weekend shifts, and years of discipline. I already had mortgage approval, and my real estate agent had found a beautiful 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. My younger brother, Ryan Collins, was everything I wasn't. He loved expensive clothes, luxury vacations, and spontaneous purchases. Saving money bored him. Somehow, though, he always landed on his feet because our parents believed he simply needed one more chance. Whenever Ryan made another financial mistake, they rushed to rescue him without hesitation. Our father, Michael Collins, constantly defended Ryan by saying he had a bigger heart than everyone else. Mom always agreed, insisting Ryan would eventually become responsible once he found the right opportunity. I stopped arguing years earlier because every conversation ended exactly the same way. I was expected to understand while Ryan was expected to be forgiven. Everything changed the afternoon Ryan announced he was getting married. His fiancée, Sophia Bennett, immediately began planning a wedding unlike anything our family had ever seen. She dreamed of a historic estate, a live orchestra, luxury cars, fireworks, and hundreds of guests. Even Ryan admitted they couldn't possibly afford something that extravagant. A month later, my parents invited me over for dinner. Halfway through the meal, my father mentioned a short-term investment opportunity managed through his longtime financial advisor. He explained that my house fund could earn several $1,000s before my closing date if I temporarily transferred it into their family investment account. At first, I refused. The money represented nearly a decade of sacrifice, and I wasn't comfortable moving it anywhere. My parents assured me everything would remain completely safe. They even promised I could withdraw every dollar whenever I needed it. After several days of pressure and reassurance, I finally agreed because I trusted them completely. 2 weeks later, Ryan's wedding invitations arrived. The venue alone looked unbelievably expensive. Every detail screamed luxury. Friends joked that Ryan must have secretly become a millionaire. I laughed with everyone else, never imagining that the money funding those celebrations had once been sitting inside my own savings account. The wedding exceeded every expectation. Guests arrived in luxury buses. A famous band performed during the reception. Fireworks lit up the night sky while drones filmed everything from above. Watching Ryan celebrate so lavishly felt strange because only weeks earlier he had admitted he couldn't even afford a modest ceremony. During the reception, I quietly asked my father how Ryan had suddenly managed to pay for everything. Dad smiled, took another sip of champagne, and simply replied, "Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime." The answer felt rehearsed, almost as though he had prepared it long before I asked. Less than 2 weeks after the wedding, my realtor called to confirm the closing date for my house purchase. Excited, I contacted my parents and asked them to transfer my savings back into my account. Instead of answering immediately, my father asked if we could meet in person the following evening. When I arrived at their house, neither of my parents looked happy. Ryan and Sophia were sitting quietly in the living room, avoiding eye contact. A thick folder rested on the coffee table between us. The atmosphere felt nothing like a normal family conversation. Something was terribly wrong, and everyone already knew it except me. Dad slowly pushed the folder toward me before clearing his throat. "Nathan," he began, "we need you to stay calm while we explain everything." My stomach immediately tightened. I hadn't even opened the folder yet, but deep inside, I already sensed that the future I had spent years planning was about to disappear. I opened the folder and found bank statements showing my entire house fund had been transferred out only days before Ryan's wedding. Before I could say a single word, my father looked directly at me and quietly admitted, "We used your money to pay for Ryan's wedding because we believed you'd understand." For several seconds, I honestly believed it was some kind of cruel joke. I looked at Ryan, expecting him to deny everything, but he kept staring at the floor. Sophia quietly wiped away tears without saying a word. My father finally admitted they had transferred nearly all of my savings to wedding vendors over the previous 3 months because canceling the ceremony would have embarrassed the entire family. I asked the only question that mattered. "Why didn't you ask me first?" My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled away before she could touch me. She quietly admitted they were afraid I would refuse. According to her, they believed it was easier to ask for forgiveness afterward than to risk disappointing Ryan before the biggest day of his life. Ryan finally spoke. He insisted he never asked our parents to take my money. He claimed they surprised him by saying everything had already been paid for. While I believed he hadn't personally transferred the money, I couldn't ignore one fact. He had happily enjoyed a luxury wedding without ever asking where hundreds of thousands of dollars had suddenly appeared. My father promised every dollar would eventually be repaid. He explained that Ryan planned to start a successful event photography business after the wedding and would return my money within 2 years. Hearing that made my chest tighten. My future home had been exchanged for a business that didn't even exist yet. I quietly stood up, closed the folder, and walked toward the front door. My mother begged me not to leave angry because we were still family. Before stepping outside, I turned around and calmly answered, "Family doesn't secretly steal 8 years of someone else's future." Then I drove away without looking back. The next morning, my realtor called to ask why the down payment hadn't arrived. Telling her I had to cancel the purchase was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. She apologized sincerely before informing me the sellers had already accepted another buyer. The house I had dreamed about for years officially belonged to someone else. Within days, relatives began calling. My parents had already shared their version of the story. According to them, I was furious because I cared more about a house than my brother's happiness. Nobody mentioned that the gift had actually been my entire life savings, transferred without my permission or knowledge. One evening, my aunt invited me over for dinner, hoping to convince me to forgive everyone. Instead of arguing, I quietly showed her the bank statements. She stared at the numbers for nearly a minute before asking if my parents had really moved $180,000 without asking me first. I simply nodded. My aunt immediately understood why I had walked away. She admitted my parents had told the family I had voluntarily loaned Ryan the money and later changed my mind out of jealousy. For the first time since the wedding, someone finally realized how badly the truth had been twisted against me. 3 weeks later, Ryan unexpectedly arrived at my apartment alone. He admitted he had recently learned the full truth about where the wedding money came from. Then he quietly placed a small envelope on my kitchen table. "I can't pay everything back," he said, "but I couldn't keep pretending I didn't owe you anything." Inside the envelope was a cashier's check for $15,000. It represented only a tiny fraction of what I had lost, but Ryan insisted it was every dollar he and Sophia had managed to save since the wedding. He promised to repay the rest over time. I looked him in the eyes and asked whether he truly believed promises still meant anything in our family. Ryan admitted he didn't expect forgiveness. He confessed that during the honeymoon, he finally asked our parents how they had afforded such an extravagant wedding. Instead of answering directly, they told him not to worry because Nathan would understand eventually. That sentence haunted him every single day after returning home. I refused the check and pushed it back across the table. Ryan looked confused until I explained that $15,000 wouldn't rebuild the trust our family had destroyed. If he genuinely wanted to make things right, he needed to stop protecting our parents' lies and tell every relative exactly what had happened. 2 weeks later, Ryan did something nobody expected. During our annual family barbecue, he stood up before dinner and admitted in front of everyone that my house fund had paid for nearly every part of his wedding. He accepted responsibility for enjoying a celebration he never should have accepted without asking questions. The backyard became completely silent. Several relatives immediately turned toward my parents. My father tried interrupting Ryan, but he continued speaking anyway. Then Ryan revealed one final detail that shocked everyone. The wedding hadn't actually cost $180,000. According to the invoices he had recently found, it had cost far more than anyone had been told. My father immediately denied Ryan's claim, insisting the invoices were inaccurate. Ryan calmly pulled several original contracts from his jacket and handed them to our uncle. One by one, relatives read through the documents. The total wasn't $180,000. It exceeded $240,000. I stared at my parents in disbelief. My entire house fund still wasn't enough to pay for the wedding. That meant someone had borrowed even more money after draining my savings. My mother quietly admitted they had taken additional bank loans because they believed Ryan deserved the perfect wedding no matter the cost. My uncle slammed the paperwork onto the table. He couldn't understand how two responsible adults had risked their retirement, their home, and my future for a single weekend celebration. My father simply answered that they couldn't bear the thought of disappointing Ryan after promising him the wedding of his dreams. Ryan looked horrified. He admitted nobody had ever promised him a celebrity wedding. He and Sophia originally wanted a small ceremony with close family and friends. Every expensive upgrade had been suggested by our parents, who insisted people would judge the family if the wedding looked ordinary. Sophia finally confirmed Ryan's story. She admitted she had repeatedly offered to reduce the guest list and choose a less expensive venue. My mother refused every compromise, saying, "Our family only gets one chance to make this wedding unforgettable." None of us realized how literally she meant those words until now. For the first time, I realized the wedding had become something much larger than Ryan. My parents hadn't been trying to make him happy. They had been chasing an image of success they wanted everyone else to admire. They were willing to sacrifice almost anything to protect that image, including my future. After that evening, our family split into two groups. Some relatives believed my parents deserved sympathy because they had acted out of love. Others argued that love built on deception eventually becomes selfishness. I stayed out of every argument because nothing anyone said could restore the years I had spent saving. I accepted a transfer from my company and moved to another city 300 miles away. Starting over wasn't easy, but distance gave me something I hadn't felt in months: peace. Instead of thinking about everything I had lost, I focused on building a future nobody else could control. 3 years later, I left my engineering job and launched a residential construction company with two close friends. We started with small renovation projects and slowly earned a reputation for quality work. Every successful project reminded me why I had worked so hard to save for a home in the first place. By the 5th year, our company was building entire neighborhoods instead of single houses. Ironically, I now designed homes for families every day, while remembering the one I had almost bought before everything fell apart. Losing that opportunity had unexpectedly pushed me towards something even greater. One autumn morning, I received a phone call from my aunt. She rarely called unless something serious had happened. Her voice sounded worried as she explained that my parents' financial situation had become much worse than anyone realized. The loans from Ryan's wedding had grown into a crisis they could no longer hide. According to my aunt, my parents had refinanced their home twice to keep making loan payments. Interest rates increased, medical expenses followed, and soon they were borrowing money just to cover previous debts. The house they had lived in for 30 years was now only weeks away from foreclosure. I thanked my aunt for letting me know, but didn't immediately respond. Part of me felt sorry for them. Another part remembered standing in their living room while my father calmly admitted he had spent my entire house fund without asking. Those memories weren't easy to forget, even after years had passed. A few days later, Ryan called for the first time in nearly a year. He sounded exhausted. His photography business had failed, his marriage was under pressure, and he admitted he had been making loan payments for our parents whenever he could. It still wasn't enough to stop the bank. Before ending the call, Ryan quietly said something that made my heart sink. "Mom and Dad are driving to your office tomorrow," he whispered. "They've convinced themselves you're the only person who can save the house, and they already think they know what your answer will be." The next morning, my receptionist called to say my parents had arrived without an appointment. When I walked into the conference room, they both stood up immediately. My mother looked exhausted, and my father suddenly seemed much older than I remembered. Neither of them spoke until the door closed behind us. My father placed several foreclosure notices on the table and admitted they had only 21 days before the bank auctioned their home. He quietly explained they had borrowed against the house to cover the wedding loans, then borrowed again to make payments on the first loans. Eventually, the debt became impossible to manage. My mother reached across the table and held back tears. "Nathan," she whispered, "we know we don't deserve your help after everything we did. But this is the only home we've ever known. Please don't let us lose it." Hearing those words hurt because I remembered begging them not to take away my chance to buy my own home. Instead of answering immediately, I carefully reviewed every financial document they had brought. The numbers were worse than I expected. Their mortgage, personal loans, and accumulated interest totaled almost $400,000. Saving the house would require far more than simply writing one check. My father tried convincing me the situation wasn't entirely their fault. He blamed rising interest rates, medical bills, and unexpected expenses. I quietly stopped him before he continued. "Dad," I said, "none of those things explain why you spent my house fund without asking." For the first time, he had no excuse. After several minutes of silence, my father finally admitted the truth. "I thought you'd recover faster than we would," he confessed. "You were always responsible. I convinced myself you could rebuild your savings, but I never imagined we'd lose everything instead." His honesty came years too late to change what had happened. I asked one question that had bothered me for 6 years. "If I had said no back then, would you still have taken my money?" My parents looked at each other before my mother quietly nodded. "Yes," she admitted through tears. We believed Ryan's happiness mattered more in that moment. We were wrong. Those words removed every remaining doubt from my mind. For years I wondered whether desperation had forced them into an impossible decision. Now I finally understood the truth. They hadn't acted out of necessity. They had consciously chosen one child's future over another because they believed I would simply recover. I closed the folder and calmly explained that I wasn't willing to hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars. My mother immediately started crying, believing I had already made my final decision. Before they could stand up to leave, I quietly told them they hadn't listened to the entire answer. "I won't pay your debts," I said, "but I may be willing to buy the property." My father looked confused. I explained that my company had recently purchased several lots in the same neighborhood for a future development. Their house happened to sit directly in the middle of land we already owned. It was valuable, but only as a business investment, not as a family favor. I made my conditions perfectly clear. Independent appraisers would determine the home's market value. The bank would be paid first. Any remaining equity would belong to my parents. There would be no special treatment simply because we shared the same last name. The transaction would follow the exact same rules as every property my company purchased. My father lowered his head and quietly admitted they had hoped I would simply pay off the mortgage while allowing them to keep living there. I gently explained that I couldn't build my company by making emotional decisions. Years earlier, they had chosen emotion over responsibility. I wasn't willing to repeat the same mistake. After discussing the proposal privately, my parents returned the following week and accepted every condition without negotiation. They finally understood they were no longer asking their son for help. They were negotiating with the owner of a construction company who happened to be their son. The sale closed 2 weeks before the foreclosure deadline. The bank received full payment, my parents avoided bankruptcy, and my company legally acquired the property. Watching them sign the final documents was emotional, but nobody argued. Every person in the room understood that this outcome existed only because of choices made years earlier. As everyone prepared to leave, my father removed a small key from his pocket and placed it in my hand. "Your grandfather told me to give you this only if I ever truly failed as a father," he said quietly. "I think that day has finally come." I stared at the old brass key, having no idea what it opened. The brass key looked ancient, worn smooth from decades of use. My father explained that it had belonged to my grandfather, who always carried it on his keychain but never told anyone what it unlocked. He simply said, "Grandpa wanted you to have it if I ever forgot what being a father truly meant." Those words stayed with me long after my parents left. A few days later, I searched through old family photographs until I found one showing my grandfather working inside his barn. Hanging from his belt was the exact same brass key. Suddenly, I remembered something from childhood. Grandpa once mentioned an old storage room beneath the workshop that almost nobody knew existed anymore. The workshop had been abandoned for years after my grandfather passed away. Since my company now owned my parents' former property, I had legal access to every building on the land. Curious, I drove there early the next morning and began searching beneath the old wooden floor exactly where I remembered Grandpa pointing decades earlier. After removing several loose floorboards, I discovered a small iron hatch hidden beneath layers of dust. The brass key fit perfectly into the rusty lock. With a loud click, the hatch slowly opened, revealing a narrow staircase leading into a forgotten underground storage room no larger than a single bedroom. Inside were shelves filled with neatly labeled boxes, old journals, family photographs, and a heavy steel lockbox. Everything had been carefully organized, as though Grandpa expected someone to find it one day. Resting on top of the lockbox was a handwritten envelope with only my name written across the front. The letter began with words that immediately brought tears to my eyes. Grandpa wrote that he had watched our family slowly change over the years. He feared that one day money would become more important than honesty. If I was reading the letter, it meant his greatest fear had probably come true. Grandpa explained that the lockbox contained family records, property documents, and personal letters meant to remind future generations that wealth could always be rebuilt. But trust was much harder to restore. He urged me never to make decisions based on guilt, anger, or pressure, because those emotions often created mistakes that lasted for decades. One document caught my attention immediately. It showed that Grandpa had quietly purchased a small parcel of undeveloped land nearly 30 years earlier. The property had never been sold and remained legally registered under a family trust. None of us had ever heard it existed until that moment. After meeting with an attorney, I learned the trust named me as the final beneficiary if Grandpa's direct instructions were followed correctly. The land had become extremely valuable because the city recently approved a major highway expansion nearby. Ironically, the forgotten property was now worth more than the house I had lost years earlier. I never told my parents about the land immediately. Instead, I spent weeks thinking about Grandpa's letter. His message wasn't about revenge or unexpected wealth. It was about learning from the mistakes that had nearly destroyed our family. I realized I had finally reached a point where anger no longer controlled my decisions. Several months later, I invited my parents to visit one of my company's newest housing developments. During the tour, my father quietly admitted he still regretted the decision they had made every single day. He said losing their home finally taught him how deeply they had wounded me 6 years earlier. Before they left, I showed them Grandpa's letter. My father read every page in complete silence before carefully folding it closed. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, he knew exactly what kind of mistakes I was capable of making. It was the first apology I believed came without excuses or expectations. Ryan eventually rebuilt his photography business from the ground up. This time, he refused every offer of financial help from our parents. Instead, he worked multiple jobs until every remaining wedding-related debt under his own name was completely repaid. He often told people that earning something honestly felt far better than receiving it unfairly. Looking back, I realized losing my dream house had changed the direction of my entire life. If my parents had never taken my savings, I probably would have lived quietly in that neighborhood forever. Instead, I built a company, created hundreds of jobs, and learned that resilience often begins the moment everything falls apart. If this story taught me anything, it's that trust is worth far more than money. A stolen savings account can eventually be rebuilt, and even a lost dream house can be replaced. But once a family chooses convenience over honesty, healing takes years. In the end, my greatest investment wasn't the money I saved. It was refusing to become the kind of person who stole someone else's future.